In this world filled with magic, there is the Alzano Imperial Magic Academy, one of the most prestigious magic schools in the world. Here, ambitious young students undergo training to become competent wizards or witches. One of the students is Rumia Tingle, a kind-hearted young woman who is willing to use her magical abilities to heal someone, even if it means breaking academy rules. Then, her friend Sistine Feeble approaches her to go to the academy together. While on the go, a man suddenly runs towards them. Surprised, Sistine immediately unleashes a magic attack on him. Although he caused this incident, the man feels no guilt at all. Instead, he acts like a victim, approaches Rumia and embraces her as if he recognizes her. To protect her friend, Sistine does not hesitate to attack him again. The man's name is Glenn Radars. Despite his poor attitude, he is a wizard who will become a substitute teacher at the academy. However, because of his unclear origins, there is a teacher who opposes his teaching at the academy. According to the teacher, Glenn is not suitable to teach talented students because his ability statistics are mediocre. In addition, he has no teaching experience and does not have a license to do so. Even so, Glenn remains a substitute teacher because he received a direct recommendation from Professor Savfk. The students were eagerly anticipating their new teacher, but when the teacher arrived in class, everyone was very disappointed because Glenn only told them to study on their own. His annoying behavior made Sistine angry and she threw a thick book at him. Because he didn't accept being pelted with books by his students, Glenn looked even more lazy and unenthusiastic in teaching. When a student asked about the lesson, Glenn couldn't answer and didn't want to help find the answer. His new teacher's attitude made Sistine even more annoyed. To calm her mind, she tried to hug Rumia. After class, when the female students were changing clothes, Glenn accidentally barged in and unintentionally saw them. This caused him to be attacked, so the next practice schedule was canceled. During lunch, Glenn deliberately sat at Rumia and Sistine's table. Even after the previous embarrassing incident, Rumia remained kind and polite to her teacher. When offered food, she didn't hesitate to try it, while Sistine acted the opposite. Seeing this, Glenn couldn't resist teasing her a little. When everyone entered the classroom, Glenn returned to his nonchalant behavior. He never taught his students and just lazed around. As a noble daughter from a wizard family, Sistine threatened to report him to her father. However, Glenn acted as if he wanted to be reported, so he could be fired immediately. To make Glenn change his attitude, Sistine even decided to challenge him to a magic duel, and Glenn gladly accepted the challenge. When the magic duel started, Glenn acted as if he were a wizard with great abilities. He even gave Sistine the opportunity to attack first, and the result was that his student was superior because she was able to cast spells faster than her teacher. However, Glenn did not want to admit defeat and pretended to forget the winner's request. He even considered this duel to end in a draw. The next day during class, Glenn continued to act as an annoying teacher. When a student tried to ask Glenn a question, Sistine immediately stopped her. With a cynical look, Sistine said there was no point in asking a teacher like that. Then Glenn asked them, what was so great and valuable about the magic they were learning? According to him, magic was completely useless and only useful for killing people. Sistine, who had always valued magic, could not accept all the facts that Glenn had stated. At that moment, she even slapped Glenn and said that she hated him. After class, Glenn saw Rumia studying magic practice. Seeing her looking confused, Glenn decided to help Rumia learn it. Seeing Glenn's enthusiasm and insight, Rumia thought that Glenn actually liked magic, but Glenn immediately denied it and said that he hated it. Rumia then told him the reason why she liked magic. 3 years ago, Rumia was captured by criminals and almost killed. Fortunately, at that time, a hero mage came and saved her. To repay her debt of gratitude to the mage, Rumia decided to study magic that was useful to humans, hoping that one day she could thank him. Rumia also said that Sistine had a deep bond with her grandfather through magic. That's why Sistine couldn't accept anyone saying bad things about magic. Rumia also reminded Glenn to apologize to Sistine immediately. The next day, surprisingly, Glenn apologized to Sistine for his behavior yesterday. Although he hated magic, he admitted that he had gone too far. After that, he suddenly reprimanded his students by calling them fools. His observations showed that they didn't understand magic fully. Regarding magic spells, Glenn explained the secrets behind them. He showed that by changing the pronunciation of a spell, one could produce different forms of magic. According to him, simply memorizing magic spells from a book is a foolish act. Currently, they are all nothing more than wizards who can only use spells without understanding their essence. Therefore, he decided to teach them from the most basic things. A few days passed and the lessons taught by Glenn became more interesting and easy to understand. This made his class famous and even attracted students from other classes to come. In a short time, Glenn managed to become a famous and reliable teacher. Professor Savfk, who was initially hopeless with Glenn, now felt proud to see his progress. She even became boastful in front of the academy head and other teachers. One day, while Professor Cecilia and other academy teachers were out of town, a group of criminals suddenly appeared, attacking and targeting Rumia. One of them also captured Sistine with the intention of harassing her. Fortunately, Glenn had arrived there and witnessed the incident. The criminal initially underestimated Glenn because he looked weak. Then Glenn took out his self-made magic tool. With this magic tool, Glenn could cancel all magic effects within a certain radius. With this, the criminal couldn't cast magic and Glenn could defeat him with martial arts. After interrogating the criminal, Glenn immediately reported the incident to Savfk. He pleaded for their help to return to the academy as soon as possible. However, Savfk and the other instructors couldn't return now because their teleportation circle had been destroyed. It was impossible for the criminals to breach the academy's magical security, so Savfk suspected an insider from the academy had helped the criminals. Despite the danger, Sistine insisted on helping Rumia. In this situation, Glenn had no choice but to step forward and face the remaining enemies. Shortly after, the enemies summoned a skeleton army. Glenn attacked them with physical attacks as much as possible, but because there were too many enemies, Sistine restrained their movements with her wind magic. Afterwards, Glenn used high-level magic to eradicate them all. The main enemy began to reveal himself. Unfortunately, Glenn had run out of energy from using magic spells beyond his capabilities. Before the enemy attacked, Glenn asked Sistine if she was strong enough to neutralize his opponent's magic sword. After getting an answer, Glenn instead threw Sistine out and faced the enemy alone. Facing the enemy, Glenn received many attacks and was severely injured. But it turned out that this was part of his plan. He deliberately made his enemy careless so that Sistine could secretly neutralize the opponent's sword. Thus, Glenn could launch a counterattack without having to use magic. Glenn needed to help Rumia immediately, but the severe injuries all over his body made him unable to walk. Even though Sistine had used healing magic, Glenn couldn't maintain consciousness. In the afternoon, Glenn woke up and saw that Sistine was also exhausted after using healing magic. Professor Savfk also contacted him at that time. Glenn asked for the location of the teleportation circle used by the criminals. After that, he immediately went there and found Rumia being held captive. Besides Rumia, there was also a traitor teacher named Huey who had planned everything. When Glenn arrived, the rewriting of the teleportation magic was almost finished and Rumia was about to be moved. In addition, Glenn couldn't attack recklessly because Huey had also cast a spell on himself to detonate the academy if he was killed. Using his blood, Glenn rewrote the spell to cancel the teleportation magic. Glenn managed to cancel several layers of the spell, but he ran out of mana before finishing it. At that moment, Rumia used her special ability. With this ability, she could increase the strength of others with just a touch. People with this special ability are nicknamed amplifiers. Because his mana was restored, Glenn successfully canceled the teleportation magic and saved Rumia. Professor Huey also had to face the consequences of his actions. Sometime later, Queen Alicia of the Alzano Empire intended to attend the magic competition at the academy. She wanted to see her daughter, who was studying there, and ensure their happiness. For this reason, a man named Zelos intended to become the queen's bodyguard during her time at the academy. At the academy, the Class 2 students had not yet determined who would participate in the magic competition. Although the queen would be present, they were not enthusiastic because they felt it was impossible to win. That's when Glenn suddenly arrived and promised victory. He ensured all students would participate in the competition and divided them based on their respective strengths. Initially, some students objected, but after Glenn explained their strengths and weaknesses in detail, they understood that Glenn always paid attention to them. Therefore, they decided to entrust everything to their teacher. But there was another reason why Glenn really wanted his students to win. He had run out of money and was eyeing the special prize from the event. Upon hearing that other classes were only fielding outstanding students, Glenn intended to do the same, but he couldn't take back his words because most of the students had agreed with the previous decision. While practicing, the Class 1 students belittled the Class 2 students and tried to chase them off the field. Glenn, who couldn't accept this, declared that his class was also aiming for victory. He even challenged the Class 1 teacher to bet 3 months' salary on his class's victory. Upon seeing her locket, Rumia recalled her dark past. At that time, a group of mages attacked and separated her from her mother, but thanks to a man who saved her, she now lived safely under the supervision of a noble family. A few days later, the magic competition began. Upon seeing the queen, Rumia looked gloomy because the queen no longer wore the same locket as her. Even so, since the competition started, her class has always been the champion. This made Rumia cheerful again and the other students even more enthusiastic. Although students from the first-year class tried to belittle them, they were not intimidated and were confident they could win. The next competition was mental endurance. In this competition, Glenn registered Rumia as a participant. Because she was only proficient in white healing magic, initially a student assumed Rumia would only be used as a sacrificial pawn. But in reality, Glenn chose Rumia because she had a steel-like mental fortitude. Since the first round, one by one, the participants began to drop out and they couldn't maintain consciousness. When the examiner released a mental manipulation technique, only Rumia and Jill from Class 1 remained. Then, when the examiner increased his power, Rumia began to kneel and looked in pain. Glenn immediately approached her and suggested she withdraw, and it turned out that Rumia became the winner in the mental endurance competition because her opponent fainted while standing. At that time, there were two soldiers overseeing the match. They were Glenn's old comrades from his time as a royal soldier. During the break, all the students ate together in the garden. Just by looking at them, Glenn felt envious because he didn't have money for food yet. A moment later, Lynn came to see him. Because she couldn't use transformation magic properly yet, Lynn wanted to be replaced by another student for the competition. Glenn didn't want to let her back down so easily. He demonstrated transformation magic to Lynn, changing his form into Rumia. Glenn explained that Lynn hadn't succeeded yet because her imagination was still vague. Therefore, Lynn was asked to observe the person she wanted to imitate to strengthen her imagination. At the same time, Sistine was looking for Rumia to have lunch together. However, she found Glenn using transformation magic instead. To get food, Glenn decided to lie to her a little, but his disguise was immediately exposed because the real Rumia was there. Actually, Sistine had prepared food for Glenn, but because of this incident, she didn't want to give it to him. Fortunately, Rumia immediately took the food and gave it to Glenn. Shortly after, the queen met them both. She deliberately came without guards because she wanted to talk to her daughter. However, Rumia refused to talk because the queen had abandoned her. As the queen was about to return to the competition area, the royal guards suddenly stopped her without a clear reason, while the tournament continued as if nothing had happened. Sistine reported to Glenn that Rumia had not returned yet. Knowing this, Glenn explained what had happened and said he would look for her. At the same time, he also said that he was now full and could search for her all day. That statement made Sistine very happy because she was the one who had made the food. When Glenn found her, Rumia told him about her relationship with the queen of the kingdom. After that, Rumia also explained the reason why she was abandoned. She said that the special power she had since birth had become a trigger that could destroy the royal family. Because of this, by exiling the princess, the future of the country could be preserved. Even though Rumia couldn't forgive the queen, Glenn said it was okay to feel pent-up anger. However, instead of running away, Rumia was encouraged to confront her feelings and express them. After that, Rumia begged Glenn to accompany her to see the queen. Unfortunately, the royal guards had surrounded her, accusing Rumia of plotting an assassination, and the guards intended to execute her. When his student was in danger, Glenn refused to stay silent. He realized there was a mastermind behind all this, and he had to bring Rumia to see the queen immediately. At that moment, Celica was near the queen, but she couldn't do anything because the queen was wearing a conditional curse necklace that forced her to eliminate Rumia. On the other hand, Glenn, who was trying to bring Rumia to see the queen, was blocked by his old acquaintances. And suddenly, Glenn and Rumia were attacked by them. At that moment, Glenn was constantly attacked with magic by Riel, and he countered with defensive magic. Then, in the middle of the fight, Riel's attack was stopped by his colleague named Albert. Although Riel had attacked Glenn, it turned out he wasn't serious and was just playing around. Therefore, Albert immediately stopped them and provided updated information about the queen. Because the information was very limited, Glenn didn't understand why the enemies were suddenly targeting Rumia. To resolve this issue, Riel proposed a plan to attack from the front, but that plan was impossible because there were many royal troops there. At this moment, Glenn could only follow Celica's orders to see the queen immediately. The current state of the school's magic competition showed that Class 1 was superior to the others, while Class 2 had fallen to last place. This happened because Glenn wasn't there to provide guidance. Shortly after, Albert and Riel arrived to replace Glenn in guiding his class. Although the students didn't recognize them, they were able to motivate the students to win the competition. Lynn, who was initially desperate, managed to overcome her anxiety and became the winner in the transformation magic competition. Finally, the Class 2 managed to catch up to the Class 1, and the next match would determine which class would win. Sistine was the last representative of Class 2 to duel against a Class 1 student. To boost the morale of his students, Albert promised to treat them to anything if they won. When the match began, the opponent unleashed a fire magic attack to strike Sistine. Sistine countered by releasing ordinary wind magic to halt the opponent's movement, and then she immediately defeated him with a more powerful wind attack. As a result, the second-year class emerged victorious in the competition. They were entitled to receive medals directly from the Queen. During the medal presentation for the winners, Albert and Riel stepped forward to represent the second-year class. When facing the Queen, Albert and Riel suddenly transformed into Glenn and Rumia. It turned out that Glenn and Rumia had been disguising themselves this whole time to escape the royal guards and approach the Queen. Seeing this, the guards suddenly prepared to attack them. But Celica released a separation barrier to prevent outside interference. Inside the barrier, Glenn informed the Queen that the guards were using her name to try to kill an innocent girl. Glenn pleaded for her to stop this senseless violence. Hearing that, Commander Zelos didn't care about them and waited for orders from the Queen. Unfortunately, it turned out that the Queen directly ordered him to punish Rumia Tingle. After going through all those events, Glenn realized that the Queen was lying. Upon observing her closely, he discovered that the Queen was wearing a curse necklace. Glenn quickly tried to remove it, but was blocked by Zelos. During the fight, the Queen suddenly removed the curse necklace herself. It turned out that Glenn had used his arcana to cancel the curse. With this, the Queen was freed from the curse and could express her true feelings to Rumia. On the other hand, Albert and Riel had found the mastermind behind this chaos. That person turned out to be the Queen's own servant, but when Albert and Riel tried to capture her, the servant managed to escape by creating a large hole in the road. Recently, Glenn invited Sistine to practice hand-to-hand combat. According to Glenn, this training is very important to sharpen her attack and defense skills during magic duels. Furthermore, if Sistine's abilities reach a sufficient level, Glenn plans to teach her military-grade magic. This is done because one day Sistine must be able to protect Rumia. One day, Sistine and Rumia saw Glenn sitting near the fountain. Then Riel suddenly appeared and attacked Glenn with her sword. Although Glenn felt Riel intended to kill him, it turned out that Riel was just giving a greeting as a fellow warrior. At that moment, Riel was wearing the academy uniform, indicating that she was a transfer student sent by the kingdom to be Rumia's guardian. However, compared to watching Rumia, Riel prioritized protecting Glenn. When Riel arrived in class, the students were curious about her origins, but they were all immediately shocked when Riel introduced herself like a military soldier. What was even more surprising was when asked about her relationship with Glenn, Riel said that Glenn was everything to her. During magic practice, Sistine displayed her great magical abilities and the other students praised Sistine's skills. They were also curious about Riel's magical abilities, but the students were disappointed because none of Riel's magic hit the target. But when Riel demonstrated other magic, they were all impressed and considered her a dangerous girl student. After practice, Riel began to be avoided by her classmates. They didn't dare approach Riel after seeing her dangerous magical abilities. Nevertheless, Rumia and Sistine weren't afraid of her. They still accompanied Riel to the cafeteria and ate together. During lunch, Riel looked like an ordinary student, which made most of the students who were previously afraid approach her again. When it was time for the school trip, Glenn took all his students to an alchemy research lab. Initially, most of the students were reluctant to go there, but when Glenn mentioned that the place was near the beach, the male students' enthusiasm immediately peaked because they could see the female students in swimwear. When they arrived on the island, Albert warned Glenn to be careful of Riel. However, Glenn wasn't too worried because Riel looked like an ordinary kid. While playing on the beach, Glenn praised Rumia and Sistine's appearance, while Riel was ignored despite approaching Glenn. Throughout the day, Glenn played beach volleyball with his students. At night, he patrolled around the inn to prevent mischievous boys from doing anything strange. Until then, there was nothing strange about Riel. She acted normally and had become more familiar with her friends. But while talking to Glenn, her emotions became unstable. This was caused by various reasons, including the perception that Rumia had stolen Glenn from her. The next day, the students continued their journey to the research lab. While walking, Riel looked very gloomy and reluctant to be approached by anyone. Sistine and Rumia were confused by Riel's change in behavior. Then, Glenn came and explained what had happened to Riel. Upon arriving at the lab's leader became their guide for a tour around the lab. The students were taken on a tour while learning about the facilities developed there. In addition to researching magic, people there also researched the combination of plants and animals, or chimeras. All of this was done to create new species. Although the place looked amazing, some things made Rumia feel uncomfortable. She didn't like seeing other people playing with the lives of other creatures. While thinking about this, Sistine felt the same way. According to her, if someone studied this too deeply, they could go astray and become an evil wizard. Fortunately, research to resurrect the dead was not carried out there. Sistine explained that according to history lessons, the kingdom had once conducted a similar project. Then Glenn interrupted the conversation and explained everything in detail. Glenn explained that the research aimed to create cloned humans. Although the project had been stopped, there were rumors that someone had stolen the research and successfully completed it. In the afternoon, Glenn again tried to persuade Riel to reconcile. However, Riel still refused to listen and preferred to be alone. While on the beach, Riel was approached by a man who claimed to be her brother. Albert was monitoring Riel, but an attack hindered him from an evil witch he had been chasing. Fighting such a witch was very troublesome. She was able to attack with large-scale fire magic and summon a large number of undead. Moreover, the witch could heal his wounds in a short time. She was different from all the evil witches Albert had faced before. But if he managed to capture her, the kingdom would gain a great advantage. Riel didn't understand why her brother was still alive even though he should have been dead. The man then tried to deceive Riel and revealed that he was still alive, but Riel didn't know. However, because he was still bound by the organization, the man asked for help to be freed, and the way to do it was to capture Rumia and eliminate Glenn, who was considered an obstacle. Riel, of course, couldn't do it, but when Glenn came to stop her, Riel suddenly changed her mind and chose to obey her brother. Riel suddenly stabbed Glenn with her large sword. Then she continued her attack on Rumia. Sistine, who witnessed the incident, was shocked and couldn't believe what Riel had done. Remembering the enjoyable times they had spent recently, Sistine was even unable to confront Riel, and Riel ultimately took Rumia away to the enemy's base. Then Albert arrived carrying Glenn's body, which was in critical condition and full of wounds. Seeing this, Sistine tried to use healing magic on Glenn from the inside. Thanks to Albert and Sistine's help, Glenn finally managed to recover. However, Albert blamed Glenn for ignoring his warnings, but since Glenn felt he wasn't given information about the enemy from the start, Glenn assumed they wanted to use Rumia as bait. Even though it was an order from his superiors, Glenn couldn't forgive the act. Regarding Riel, Albert stated he would eliminate her if she tried to stop him, while Glenn would try to fix his mistake, because Riel was his student. After the decision was made, they immediately went to find Rumia. On the other hand, Rumia was about to be used as a sacrifice to continue the resurrection project. The enemy used Rumia's power to operate a giant magic machine. Shortly after, Glenn and Albert entered the underground tunnel. By utilizing the trackers that had been installed earlier, they were able to pinpoint Rumia's location. But when the enemies realized there were intruders, they immediately deployed the developed chimeras. However, the chimeras turned out to be not strong enough to stop them. With a single attack, they could easily defeat them. After failing to stop them, the lab head named Burks decided to face them directly. Meanwhile, Riel was told to stay put and guard Rumia. At the same time, the students were worried about Rumia and Riel. They wanted to go help their teacher to save Riel and Rumia. However, because it was very dangerous, Sistine begged them to entrust this to their teacher. She realized that they couldn't do much and would only be a burden. While Albert was facing Burks, Glenn had arrived at the research site. Upon arriving there, Glenn tried to convince Riel, who had been deceived by her fake brother. He told Riel that her brother had died 2 years ago. Even though Glenn tried to convince her, Riel still attacked him, convinced that her brother was still alive. However, when Glenn asked about her brother's name, Riel suddenly stopped attacking because she couldn't remember her brother's name. Glenn seized this opportunity to turn the tables. He used gravity magic to stop Riel and destroy the surrounding facilities. Shortly after, Riel began to remember her brother's name. She also realized that she was merely a copy or clone of a human, inheriting his memories while the original had died trying to escape the Life Resurrection Project. After learning the truth, Riel was willing to listen to Glenn. In the end, Glenn managed to convince Riel to rejoin his side. As Glenn was about to finish off Riel's fake brother, he was suddenly protected by many clones of Riel. Glenn, who was quite overwhelmed fighting them, was eventually helped by Riel to defeat them. After yesterday's incident, Riel managed to reconcile with her friends again, and the students resumed enjoying their school trip at the beach. Seeing the students become close again, Albert thought that perhaps this was the scene Glenn wanted to protect. After the school trip, Riel began living at Sistine's house. The Feeble family welcomed Riel warmly, treating her like their own child. Although she still felt awkward, after dinner, Riel brought up the school trip again. She felt bad towards Sistine and Rumia because she hadn't had a chance to apologize. Embracing her, Sistine and Rumia stated that there was no problem. Riel thanked them and said that they were both precious friends. While in the library, Sistine met Celica. Celica was preparing to enter the underground labyrinth. While Sistine was reading a book, Glenn suddenly approached her. He wanted to thank Sistine for saving his life. But Glenn instead reminded Sistine of the incident when Sistine provided healing with lip contact. Riel, seeing Sistine become embarrassed, assumed Glenn was teasing her. Without thinking twice, Riel immediately attacked him, causing chaos in the library. When leaving the library, Glenn was almost hit by a horse carriage. Fortunately, the carriage's passenger acted quickly, preventing Glenn from an accident. The person riding the horse carriage was named Leos. He was invited by the academy as a special instructor and claimed to be Sistine's fiancé. Knowing this made Glenn unable to resist teasing him. If everything went smoothly, Glenn said he would give a speech at their wedding day. While teaching, Leos did it flawlessly. He helped the students understand material that even regular military soldiers found difficult to grasp. However, this was too fast for them. Depending on its use, basic magic could be used to kill someone. After the lesson ended, Leos invited Sistine for a walk together and to discuss something important. Rumia felt something was amiss. She asked Glenn to accompany her to eavesdrop on their conversation. Actually, Glenn didn't like interfering in other people's private matters, but when Leos suddenly proposed to her, Glenn got caught up in the moment. Sistine rejected the proposal, stating she couldn't marry before achieving her dreams. Despite being rejected, Leos persisted in his wishes, making Glenn unable to resist interfering in their affairs. Leos told Glenn not to interfere in their affairs because Glenn had no right to do so. But suddenly, Sistine said that Glenn was her lover who had sworn their future together. However, Leos still didn't give up and insisted on getting Sistine. To protect his student, Glenn would settle it with a magic duel. Leos insisted on testing their abilities as magic instructors. They would hold a war exercise between the wizard divisions. In this exercise, the students would act as troops while their teachers would be commanders. The rules of the match were that whoever could defeat the opponent's commander would be the winner. Before the match started, Mr. Ali, who was the match's judge, explained the rules and the match time, which would last for 3 hours. Then Leos suddenly approached Sistine and told her not to worry about him because he would exert all his strength. The other female students asked Sistine if she would really marry whoever won. Sistine quickly denied the question, although she briefly thought about it if Glenn won and proposed to her. On the other hand, Glenn encouraged his troops and asked for their help to win the match, so he could become a son-in-law to the royal family. Shortly after, the magic troop match began. At the start of the match, Glenn had already lost 2 troops. In addition to utilizing the students in the elite class, Leos had taught them to use a 3-squad formation. This was a basic tactic in modern magic warfare. Although Leos' tactics were superior, Glenn chose to use a simple tactic. By implementing a 2-squad attack, they could destroy the opponent's formation that tried to attack them. Furthermore, Riel herself was also sufficient to defeat the opponent's squad. Leos, who was initially ahead, was now starting to fall apart. No one could predict who the winner would be. At that moment, Leos couldn't command his troops anymore. His troops' focus was scattered, and they chose to chase Glenn, who suddenly entered the match area. Even some of them fell into the traps that Glenn had prepared earlier. The match continued until the allotted time ran out. Since neither commander had been defeated, the match was ultimately declared a draw. Although he didn't win, Glenn praised his students' efforts while Leos blamed the students and vented his frustration on them. Leos still refused to admit defeat. This time, Leos challenged Glenn to a duel, and of course, Glenn wanted to accept the challenge. Sistine tried to stop him, but her words fell on deaf ears, making her very angry. Rumia didn't want to see Sistine resent her teacher. She wanted to see them get along and talk things out. In the afternoon, Leos revealed his evil intentions. The reason he was targeting Sistine was to gain power from the Feeble family branch. At night, Sistine came to see Glenn. She seriously asked why he had to accept Leos's challenge. Initially, Glenn jokingly replied that he just wanted to marry a noblewoman, but when Sistine didn't respond, Glenn became serious and recounted his past, filled with bloody events. In that story, there was a girl named Sarah who looked very similar to Sistine, but he caused the girl to die in a mission. Glenn explained that the reason he wanted to defend Sistine was to atone for his sins. Shortly after, Leos came to approach them. He deliberately provoked Glenn by recounting his past failures. When Glenn started to get baited, Leos attacked using magic that conjured illusory creatures. Glenn was helpless against them, especially with Leos's various malicious words, causing Glenn to despair and choose to surrender. Since that night after Glenn's defeat, Sistine had officially become Leos's fiancée. Lately, Sistine had always looked gloomy, especially after realizing that Leos's true nature was different from what it used to be. She really hoped that her teacher Glenn would help her. However, Glenn never showed up and didn't even come to school anymore. Sistine, who had always prioritized her dream of becoming a magic archaeologist, now felt she had to accept reality and accept Leos's proposal. Riel didn't understand what was happening, but she really wanted to fight Leos because she felt that Leos was her enemy. A few days earlier, Rumie had spoken with Glenn, therefore she asked Riel to be patient and wait for Glenn's next move. Actually, Sistine wanted to refuse the marriage, but she couldn't cancel it because Leos threatened to reveal Rumie and Riel's identities. When the bride and groom were about to exchange their wedding vows, Glenn suddenly appeared and caused a commotion. He declared his objection to the marriage and immediately took Sistine away to the town center. Glenn had suspected that Leos was using Rumie to threaten him. Therefore, he had to make many preparations to seriously confront him. Then Leos used his magic to control the townspeople and target Glenn. The method he used made Glenn realize that his enemy wasn't Leos, but a former royal executioner named Jadis. And indeed, when Leos confronted them, he suddenly transformed into Jadis. Jadis had planned all of this just to fight Glenn. In the name of a justice he believed in, Jadis even willingly involved many innocent people in his plan. Then Glenn asked Sistine to run away and go to a safe place. Glenn had prepared himself to fight. When Jadis unleashed his special move, he immediately destroyed it by firing a modified pistol. While Jadis was off guard, Glenn secretly threw needles towards his eyeballs. However, all of that was not enough to defeat him. Besides, Glenn couldn't keep attacking because his bullets were very limited. When Glenn was in trouble, Sistine returned to help him. She didn't want to stand idly by after being saved by her teacher so many times. Initially, Glenn had lost his composure, but with Sistine's presence, they could work together as an attacker and defender. Every attack launched by Sistine was able to penetrate the opponent's defense. Until Jadis unleashed his strongest magic, Sistine still managed to destroy it. After the magic creature was destroyed, Glenn immediately approached him and punched him with all his might. Exerting a large amount of magical energy exhausted Sistine, and while Glenn was checking on Sistine's condition, Jadis seized this opportunity to escape with his magical creature. After the battle, the students came to pick them up, and with this, all problems were resolved. But at night, Glenn and Albert held a meeting in a bar. Albert said that their target was still roaming out there and might cause problems in the future. Nevertheless, Glenn remained calm and continued his daily life as an academy magic teacher. He vowed to protect the students to atone for his past sins.